I am really pleased to be joined by Mary Pilon, who is the author of The Monopolists, which is a fascinating story about the true history of the game of Monopoly, its original intentions, which, uh, as Mary will share with us, is sort of the opposite of how a lot of people see it today. It's a game that's uh, you know business oriented to a degree. The game of Monopoly itself almost seems like it's celebrating Monopoly, yet the history tells a very different story. And I just got to say again, Mary, this book was a lot of fun to read as a game developer and just as I think half of it was like a detective story, and it was just a blast to cover. And
Oh,
so
thank you.
and thanks again for taking time to chat today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
So, I don't want to spoil the story for readers, so we'll probably won't dive in as much to the second half of the book. But I'm really interested in the birth of Monopoly in itself, which is originally called the Landlord's Game. So ahead of that, I'm just curious how you first became interested and aware of the story of Monopoly, and what made you ultimately decide to write The Monopolists.
So that's a great question. All of it came about by accident. I grew up playing a lot of board games and puzzles. I grew up in Oregon, so cold and rainy, inside a lot. And I've always just been kind of a nerd for them. I was in 2009. I was reporting on business and finance, and I was going to mention in passing the story that I had heard that Monopoly was invented by a man during the Great Depression. And I was looking around and looking around. I couldn't find anything. I thought that would be like the easiest thing to verify of all, and it wasn't adding up. And I was so frustrated. And then on a whim, I reached out to Ralph Anspach, who I had seen had been involved in litigation with Parker Brothers, gosh, maybe 20 or 30 years earlier. And I knew it was a long shot. And I just said, like, hey, I'm trying to find out the truth about Monopoly. And he immediately got back to me and was like, oh, it's a crazy story. And so I
Yeah.
started reporting what ended up becoming an article in the Wall Street Journal. And then, usually when you close a story, you're like really sick of it and you don't want to think about the topic ever again. But this was kind of the first time in my career where I was like, I have many more questions about this. I want to know who this woman was. I wanted more detail. So from that article, I kept reporting, and that ultimately became the book proposal. And so from start to finish, it took over, oh gosh, about 5 years.
Wow.
So, I didn't know. I have a friend who says, I was asking him for advice on books because, like me, he'd worked at newspapers and then done books, and he was like, take how much time you think it will take and double it. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
so
Was
so it ended up
wa-
being much more of a winding reporting process than I ever could have predicted.
was The Monopolist one of your first books?
It was the first.
The
Yeah. And I
first.
wasn't, yeah. And I don't know if this is of interest or not, but like, I love writing for newspapers and magazines. Like, I wasn't one of those people that was like obsessed with doing a book. It was more like I started reporting and looking into this, and it just became so long and so unwieldy that a book was one of the few ways that I could, have the space to tell the story. I mean, it spans
Yeah.
150 years and involves all these people, and it's so long and winding. So the book format kind of grew out of the story part of it. So
Yeah.
yeah, and
Well,
here we
that's
are.
that's that's amazing, and for a first book, I think you did this story justice, and yeah, it was a encapsulating read, or a engaging read rather.
Thank
Um,
you.
so, I definitely understand what you're talking about with, growing up playing board games. I remember growing up and playing Monopoly, as do I think a lot of people who have some familiarity with board games. As you talk about in the book, it's sort of become one of the most popular board games of all time. And I think, if you ask someone what's the name of a board game, that's probably the one that they'll go to. And in general, just from your experience with it and interviewing people, what do you think it is about the game itself and its gameplay from when it first started as the landlord's game to its more recent incarnation as Monopoly? What about it do you think captures people's excitement?
That's a great question. And it's a really counterintuitive one because I think 100 years ago, if you had said, oh, a board game about real estate is going to be this huge
Yeah,
bestseller, everybody would have thought you were crazy. And there wasn't really a commercially sold game that was popular the way that this one was. You have these things like chess and checkers, but those are in the public domain. So the whole idea of a game like this being, perennial was really new. I think all games, including this one, there's like a fantasy element to it that people can
Yeah.
do something that they might not be able to do in real life. And the vast majority of Americans now don't own tons of property. They don't have wads of cash. Like this is something I think, especially for kids, it's really fun. So I
Yeah.
think that that's part of the game is that it gives you a context to act differently than maybe you could in real life. And I think if you look at any game that's been really successful, including video games, there has to be like, I think it's true of TV shows too, in some ways, like there has to be like a fantasy ingredient somewhere in
Yeah.
there. So in some ways, I think board games give us that way before TV, radio, movies, all these other media that we now go to all the time.
Right. There's that element of of role playing where you get to live out some sort of fantasy. And of course, like as you mentioned, the real estate fantasy doesn't necessarily seem appealing today, but back when there weren't other game opportunities for people to really go live out some different life, it seems like Monopoly was a way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think we um, forget that these were also ways of communicating. And if
Mm,
so, Lizzie Magie, at her core, I think she was an activist, but also an educator. So it feels weird maybe today for somebody, hey, I really want to change how people think politically. I'm going to go make a board game. That feels weird to us today. But in her time, that wouldn't have been unusual. I mean, Milton Bradley, and I read about this in the book a little bit, was one of our early advocates for kindergarten in the United States and was deeply
mm,
interested in how kids learn and how games could play a role in education. And now it's funny because in the last few years, board games have kind of had this renaissance, and you're seeing a lot of people kind of going back to board games as being a really wholesome, great thing to do. But 150 years ago, games with dice were considered to be related to gambling and potentially evil, and so we've kind of come
yeah.
full circle on the moral panic aspect of it.
Yeah, and we'll touch on this a little bit in a second, but just what you noted about Milton Bradley, I remember reading in your book that initially Milton Bradley was maybe still more focused on games that had some sort of social mission or wanted to tell some sort of story, whereas the Parker brothers were a little bit more focused on just raw fun. And it's interesting to me to think about, why the board game became this communication tool initially. Um, that said, speaking about the renaissance of games, something that what we're seeing as well is there is sort of a sect of games called serious games, which
Mm-hmm.
have been developing to try to teach new ideas or communicate some issue in society, something like that. So yeah, this rise of serious games has sort of become this new sect in the renaissance of new games. But it would still seem that, at least in my perspective, and I would not profess to be an expert in the tabletop community, but it still would seem to me that there's still a lot of focus on the fun. Like there's a lot of
Totally.
camaraderie, and there's still like with the rise of D&D as well. A lot of that interpersonal using a game to just spend time with your friends. So that's on the rise. I haven't seen as much of that social focus. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, I just wrote a piece for Bloomberg Business Week last week about how you can now be a professional dungeon master, and
Yeah,
how D&D is having this huge renaissance now. And I think it's not just as simple as like, oh, nostalgia is a big deal now, and Stranger Things is a great show, although it is. I
yeah,
think that I give Wizards of the Coast some credit for making the fifth edition both accessible for new players or people who haven't played in a long time, but also for people who are really amazing dungeon masters and really want a lot of flexibility in the game. And D&D is an interesting example because it's actually a cooperative game, right? Like it's if you want your kids to be playing something, I mean, I think that's a really good game to be playing because it's imaginative, there's storytelling. I talked to some parents who are like, oh God, my kid put their phone down. This is great. So, and that was a game that in the 80s and 90s, excuse me, the religious really went after and thought was
Yeah.
satanic. So again, you have this like, and in my story, I interviewed a guy who's a dungeon master pastor. So he
Yeah.
is a ordained pastor who will use D&D in his communion classes to train other pastors. He has a game night at his church. So I think it's like a great irony, but also one of the things that's happening, and this is true of all the variants of Monopoly and all the whole tabletop world, is now you have Kickstarter. So if you were a
Right.
game designer, 30 years ago, your best bet was to try and sell to one of these big publishers. And now you can just raise enough money to print these things and get them out there. And you have things like Exploding Kittens, which I don't think any game buyer would have bought 30 years ago. And it's obviously like
Sure.
a huge success. So it's exciting. I think it's like a really good time to be both inventing and creating these things. And ironically, it's technology, in Twitch too. I think it has played a huge role, especially with D&D. Like that's brought a lot of this stuff back, the analog games.
Absolutely. And for us too, I think that's something that we felt confident about trying to create a game in the first place as first time game developers is just there seems to be now a roadmap for how to do it, how to, access a manufacturer that is affordable, how to market and eventually, sell your game on Kickstarter. There's a blueprint, whereas, right, 5 or 10 years ago, you really had to work hard to pull all the pieces together. I hear about all these stories of friends whose parents they're like, oh yeah, my dad tried to create a game like 30, 40 years ago and it just never got off the ground. But as you've mentioned, technology is aiding these, in a way, technology-less games. Well, still, it's a different type of technology, but an electronic-less tool in technology is enabling the creation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
so to shift gears a little bit, could you tell me a bit about Elizabeth Magie and looking back at what she saw in the board game medium in itself, and as I understand, what she was trying to communicate was the single tax system and the dangers of monopoly, and these were both focuses of Georgism, as I understand.
Correct. So she's a fascinating woman, and there's some things about her that kind of make her an outlier for her time. So she was infused with politics and economics from a very young age. Her father, James Magee, was this known politician in Illinois at the time and had been an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. So at a time when women couldn't vote, she was right in the belly of a really fascinating and exciting time in American political history and had a front row seat. She didn't marry until she was 44, very unusual for her time. And she had also worked as a stenographer, which is a job that I kind of got in the rabbit hole with because it allowed women access to the workplace. I mean, that was
Hmm.
considered progressive at the time. Um, so when she invents her game, this was at a time when women were told, don't even bother to put your name on a patent because we won't approve it. So she uses her initials. She's very crafty about how she goes about creating this
Interesting.
game. And Henry George, we don't know, he's not a name that a lot of people outside of econ circles really know today, but he was a
Hmm.
huge deal in his time. I mean, his book, Progress and Poverty, was a massive bestseller. He would tour the country, and I found all these newspaper clippings of people just packing into these halls to hear him speak about the single tax. And this was, at a time in the this is like the turn of the century when there was an insane amount of wealth being created, a lot of questions being asked about how it was being distributed. And there were times when I was researching this where I would read some of his speeches or op-eds or things about what he was saying, and it felt like I was reading about today, especially because I
Wow.
started reporting this during the recession. So
Yeah.
Magee was really involved in this movement, and Henry George was also there was a kind of an overlap between the Georgists and the women's suffrage movement too. So it's not too surprising. So again, she wants to teach people. She had done theater, she had done public speaking, she had written poetry, she had done a lot of other mediums for her kind of various creative outlets. But a board game, I think is a pretty neat way of her. She's educating people about these things, but this is like yet another way that she can communicate what she wants to see in the world.
Yeah.
To people young and old. So she creates this game, gets the patent, and it's approved in 1904. And she has two rule sets. She has like a monopolist rule set, which is the one that we're mostly familiar with, and an anti-monopolist rule set in which you're breaking things apart. So ironically, it's that monopolist one that kind of takes off and spreads.
Yeah. That's it's just such an amazing story, and as your book explains how it was sort of buried in a very deliberate way by some people involved with Parker Brothers. So I just that story in itself is just amazing. How was Lizzie's game received? So originally it was called the Landlord's Game,
Hmm.
and it sounds like it was played by fellow Georgists initially, and then it's adapted by tons of different groups in different ways. So, yeah, what were the reactions to her game at the time?
Yeah, and honestly, in putting all this together, that window from 1904 to the mid 1930s was one of the most challenging to report because
Yeah.
the game, it spread, but this was obviously way before the internet or before we could track it. So what we know at a minimum is that it was played pretty extensively by like a who's who of left-wing America, and it was really
Mm,
popular on college campuses. It was played at Columbia. It was played in Boston. It was played in Pennsylvania. And what's unclear is how much of this Lizzie knew. And the game, when people would play it, they would make their own version of it. It was much more of a folk game. So you would localize the board to make the properties more like, if you were in Boston, you'd have Boston street names. If you were in Chicago, you would have the loop on there and that kind of thing. So we know that she was aware enough of the game spread that in 1924, she renews her patent, which would have been concurrent with what the patent laws would have required. So she understood it was being played. And at one point, this one community, Arden, Delaware, plays. It's really popular there, and we know that she had corresponded with Upton Sinclair, and that she
hmm
was aware of, and she was living in Washington D.C. And like I said, she was the daughter of a political animal, so there's some indication that she knew that it was spreading, but how much is a little unclear. And it's a
Yeah.
version of this game that people kind of modified a little bit. That is what Charles Darrow eventually plays. And so that, it's kind of like a tree with all these different branches, and that 1904 patent is kind of the trunk of it. So as the game was spreading, it kind of led to all these offshoots like,
hmm
finance and inflation and eventually what the Atlantic City Quakers would play and teach Darrow. So, but you can trace the roots when you look at these boards. It's really uncanny because you can see the core of her original game still in there.
Yeah. So, on that note, uh, did was there any indication that uh, Elizabeth's ideals were being effectively communicated? I remember reading that there's a notable professor that would use it to teach some of these ideals in his courses. Um, but were you able to uncover any clear notice of people saying, yeah, this is what this game is for, and we are using it as an effective learning tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the professor you mentioned, his name is Scott Nearing, and he's a really interesting guy. He was involved in a huge academic freedom case at Wharton, and later became one of the pioneers of like the Green Movement before that was really much of a thing.
Mm,
So if her goal was to have her game played, I mean, look at today. Like you can't argue with the fact that so many people played the game, but how many people in the 30s or today pick up a game of Monopoly or the Landlord's Game and are like, let's talk about Henry George and single tax theory? Not a
yeah.
lot. So that's tricky, and she didn't get credit for her role until very, very recently. So I think it's a tricky question because on the one hand you could argue, yeah, you've got people talking about business and capitalism, but on the other hand, I've talked to a lot of people about this, like that Monopoly actually teaches kids kind of some I mean, this is the rules that she was trying to show the evil side of. Like in reality, you don't have to bankrupt all your friends to be wealthy, right? Like the pie of success is large. We can all share slices of it. So I mean, at least that's what one of my views about capitalism is, that you don't need to destroy everybody in sight to
Yeah.
be profitable, right? So it's interesting because I think that there's an irony. And when I was working on the book, I was also covering Occupy Wall Street, and I
Mm,
remember thinking how funny it was that people were using images from the game in their protests against Wall Street. And I thought, oh well, that would make Lizzie Magie really happy
yeah.
because like the game has become this talking point for excess and, robber barons and like a lot of the same issues that she was concerned with. So it's kind of morally gray. And I've always loved hearing from readers about that because, it's come full circle in a way. But I don't think if her ultimate goal was to teach people about the details of Henry George, I think that got lost pretty early on.
Yeah. And that's honestly something that we think a lot about too with our game is uh, how it could be misinterpreted by people who might play well, and by people who might try to interact with the story that we're trying to tell. Um, so some things that we've thought about is, would Monopoly today be more effective with a very specific prompt, or does it just require a certain setting and a certain level of thoughtfulness to be able to take away the lessons that Lizzie was trying to communicate? And it doesn't seem likely that Parker Brothers is going to go throw like a really clear statement into the box now about what the game is meant to communicate. But yeah, that's just something that we wonder is how one can be effective with a game like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, at best, any piece of art, whether it's a game or a movie or a book, is like a catalyst for a bigger conversation, right? So, I remember my parents always talking to me about that, like, like what I just said, like that in reality, you don't have to destroy your brother
Right.
to be successful in life. So I think that that's, it's kind of an open door because the truth is, especially if we're talking about kids, like they're going to get exposed to all sorts of stuff, right? And so I don't have kids, but I imagine like you can't shield them from everything forever. So games, and Jane McGonigal, I think, has done some really great writing on this in terms of video games and how to approach kids with gaming addictions and kids, how to kind of use the same challenge reward mindset that games give us in other aspects of kids' lives. So it's tricky, but I don't, just given my, Hasbro did not comment for my book. I asked many times. To this day, they still really won't acknowledge that Lizzie Magie was the inventor. Why that is, you'd have to ask them. So I think
Yeah.
you're right that like I don't see a giant company that's, making a lot of money off of their giant trademark and all, going to bat anytime soon. Although, you know, my email address is out there. Um,
Yeah.
so I would be surprised. But that's what's been so funny about the book is that so many people I've talked to over the years are like, how did this stay secret for so long? And I'm like, Ralph, who I write about in the book, he spent 10 years fighting. Like, this was kind of, yes, I dug up a lot of stuff, but a lot of it was kind of hidden in plain sight and that it was historical records and public records. And I was able in the book, it's fully footnoted and to list out all my sourcing and stuff. So people could fact check me and I wanted it to be the start of a conversation. I think sometimes people
Yeah.
think of books as these like end all be all definitive words. And I mean, I just wanted the story to get out there, but I also love that, it's led to conversations like this one about what does this all mean? What does it mean for people making games now, playing games? Does the game designer's original intent really matter? If so, how
Mhm.
and why? And, I think Monopoly, because everyone knows it, is such an easy game that everyone can have those conversations around because you don't have to be an RPG dork or, super into it to kind of wonder about all this. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Absolutely. No, I think about what it's going to be like now for me to go play Monopoly again after reading your book. Like, I'm sure I will still be able to take the same sort of enjoyment out of like destroying my brothers at the game, but all of a sudden it takes on a new meaning and you understand why, some of those almost carnal desires to just beat other people in the game and be selfish in the game. You learn why, why those are dangerous things and how that can apply to a wider context. So yeah, with that prompt of information, the game really does take on a whole new meaning and you're sort of able to check yourself. At least that's what I expect the new experience will be. Um, what how do you think Lizzie's impression of the effectiveness of her board game changed over time? Obviously, as it was picked up by Parker Brothers at the time, she saw some of what it became. Someone that she reminds me of. One of my favorite authors is H.G. Wells, who wrote these fantastic stories, which originally called scientific romances, but they were all meant to comment on something. More often, it was a lot about the class system. and he sort of fell, as I understand, uh, seemed like he felt that he wasn't being effective in communicating his ideals through his books, and eventually took to more essay-focused writing. And I'm
Hmm.
curious uh, what Lizzie's experience was in seeing her game evolve.
Yeah, and again, that's one where I had to kind of go off of what we know. There's this really incredible episode in the whole saga where in the mid 1930s, the game becomes this huge craze, and Charles Darrow is being hailed as the inventor. And at this point, Lizzie Magie is an elderly woman. She's living in D.C. She's outlived her husband. She doesn't have any children, and she's working as a secretary in total obscurity. And that's when the deal with Parker Brothers kind of goes, where they basically say, we're going to publish two of your other games. And she thinks this is so great. Parker Brothers, this huge maker of these big games, is going to publish my games. And for her as a political person wanting to get her message out, this is great news. But there's little evidence that they did anything to really promote those
Yeah,
games. $500. So not only is she written out of the history as the inventor, which I think for her identity as somebody who was, an actress and a writer and made this hugely popular thing. So she did live to see the game explode and be played, all over the place. In some ways, I see her as this tragic figure and a totally this lost 70s that exhumes her whole story. So
yeah,
nobody could have predicted, including Ralph, that her story would ever see the light of day. And since the book came out, I've had so many people, not just in the game world, but outside, email me about, other kind of like Lizzie McGee's who are out there. And I'm actually working on a couple projects about this now, where there are these people who chip away at the world and make these things, and we don't know their stories. We don't know their original intent often gets lost. And I think, the H.G. Wells example is a really good one, because you see so many writers too, where, it's a weird, and there's kind of a meta angle to this, because this happened with my book. Like the
yeah.
minute it's dead to you, like as the creator, and you're done with it and you're exhausted, is like exactly when it gets birthed to the world. So,
Huh.
and you have no idea like what people are going to make of it or not, and there's like something kind of terrifying about that. um, and I think with newspapers, I'd kind of had like a daily or weekly dose of that. Like I know what it's like to be on the front page in the morning and then in a litter box by the afternoon. But with this story, it just felt, so much more unpredictable. And I think that in a weird way, I connected with that part of her,
Yeah,
that she put this game out there. And nobody, I think that's a big part of the story, is that nobody knew, including Darrow or Parker Brothers, that this game would become what we now know. I mean, I don't think anybody would have predicted that, decades later, people would be sitting around talking about this thing. So, hindsight's 2020, but yeah. So I don't know. I think that it took me a long time to do this story, and whenever I'd ask myself like, why am I spending all this time on this crazy project, I'd be like, no one else is going to tell this,
yeah,
and even Ralph, who had spent so much time, kind of in this impassioned crusade and had been talking about it forever. I was like, this needs like a journalist touch. This needs somebody who's not being paid by a company or not suing one or anything, to kind of look through this stuff and figure out kind of who the characters are and what the pulse of it all is. So
yeah. Well,
yeah, I don't know. I thought about her a lot.
I mean, that's wonderful. And the fact that someone like you can come around and uncover all these, the story of Lizzie, and that's really exciting to hear that you're looking into other people sort of buried by history, and as it relates to our story, probably buried by privilege and
Yeah.
uh, people who were in charge of writing the books or revising history to fit a certain narrative, uh, often are burying people who have been marginalized for one reason or another. And Elizabeth McGee's story is fantastic. I'm so glad to be able to talk to you about it.
Oh,
Um,
thank you. She did
what
all the work.
what what your book talks a lot about what ended up happening with the game and how it evolved, and Parker Brothers' drive to like keep the history a secret. So I'll leave that to folks who want to pick up the book to read it and find out more about that. But you mentioned how there are still some nuggets of Lizzie's original game in today's version of Monopoly. I'm curious, like what pieces of of her version remain, and what of her story about the single tax system is still there. And further, if you think you touched on this a little bit as well, but if Lizzie were to see how the world perceived her game today, what she might say.
Oh man,
Two very different questions.
there's a
Sorry
lot
to
in that
lump
question.
those together.
Yeah, I'll try and take it in two parts. So the first part, in terms of her game, you see, so in her day there were no cars, so instead of free parking, you'd have like park, right? Georgists are really interested in land and like how it's used, and so you still see that in there. You have railroads, utilities, that kind of thing. So it's still very much a property game, right? For all of the
Yeah.
changes that have happened to it. And the second part of your question, what would she think about it today? Did I understand that
Yeah.
correctly? Sorry. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. If she
Um,
kind of saw how people perceive it.
it's kind of, it's a tricky question because in some ways I feel like it's the total opposite of what she would have wanted.
Yeah.
It's about greed and money and bankrupt each other. It's, like I said, it's that monopolist rule set that took off. So tough question. I mean, I don't know if she'd be pleased. So in terms of the popularity of the game, I think she'd be thrilled because it's being played all over the place. But I think so much of her message got lost, right? And that in a weird way, she was kind of a victim of the very system that she was complaining about. So I don't know, it's tough. And I think one of the frustrations for me in doing this book is that I normally write about living people. Like I'm trained in newspapers, and when you get stuck, you call someone, and if they don't talk to you, you call around. When somebody dies in 1948, you can't just
Yeah.
pick up the phone and say, "Hey, what do you think?" So
Right.
it's one of the many questions that looms for me of what she would make of it today, and I don't know. And
Mm.
I don't think she was happy with the outcome in her lifetime. So we'll see. I have no idea. If only we could raise the dead sometimes.
I know. Well, I mean, I think to have written what you've written and uncovered what you did in a way that I think it's really a wonderful thing for her legacy and her story. So, in a way, I think you did sort of raise a spirit of Elizabeth Magie. And, you know, again, as I said, at least for me personally, now being able to take that prompt of information into the game of Monopoly, I'm able to take a lot more out of the game. And it seems that the more that message can reach people of what it's trying to communicate, those seeds are already planted. People understand kind of what they have done in that experience, but they may not be able to process it fully. So yeah, I really hope more and more people are able to run into this true story in your book. And again, it's just been a pleasure to learn about.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so glad. I mean, you work on these things for so long and you feel like you're crazy. So the idea that someone who's not a relative read it is like still like very exciting.